And welcome back to The Price of Business. This is William Edmundson filling in for Kevin Price. We've got a busy day, so let's move on to our next guest. We've got a group from Lanier Middle School, a group called Lanier Watchdog. And we want to talk a little bit about this. Each of the people in the studio, of which we have 3 people who are joining us today, are part of the Lanier Watchdog, and it is made up of parents, students, members of the Lanier Middle School community, the neighborhood, and they are challenging the name change of Sidney Lanier Middle School, which the HISD Board of Trustees has voted to do, and they would like the subject revisited. So welcome to the studio. Welcome to The Price of Business.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So I understand that each of you either have a child in the school or you live in the community, and this is a real issue to you because there was not an outcry from the community. There was not an outcry from the students to change the Lanier name. So I'd like it if we could talk a little bit about that today. And why don't each of you introduce yourself real quickly, and then we'll go through some questions.
Hi, I'm Ron Kahanek. I'm a longtime resident of the neighborhood. My youngest son has just graduated from Lanier and is now at another HISD school. I've been a practicing CPA and community member in Houston since forever.
I'm Adrienne Murry, and I have a daughter who attends Lanier and another younger daughter who attends another HISD school. And my daughter is a third-generation Lanier student, and I am a community member, and we are zoned to Lanier.
And I'm Angela Foster. My 7th grader, Emily, is currently at Lanier. My 9th grader, Audrey, went all the way through. I am a member of the PTO and have done my required time on lots of booster clubs and other volunteer opportunities at the school.
Well, good. And just in full disclosure, I've got a son at Lanier, and I live in the Lanier community. We're zoned to that school as well. Okay, so when all of this came up, honestly, I don't think very many people knew who Sidney Lanier was. A lot of people knew that he was a poet. Adrienne, tell us a little bit about how there are different schools and different streets that are named in that area. Tell us a little bit about that, if you would.
Right. So Lanier was named. Was named in the 1920s, and if you look at the map of schools in the area and you look at the map of streets in the area, what's interesting to note is that Lanier, it was named after Sidney Lanier, who was a poet and an anti-war writer. But if you look at the streets around, we've got Hawthorne, we've got Kipling, and even Montrose. All of those are named after different poets. In the 1920s, Houston was going through a literary renaissance, if you will. And so they were trying to put themselves on the map as far as the arts and literature. Mm-hmm. And so the school was not named because of any Confederate ties. Quite frankly, none of us even knew that he was even in the Confederacy.
Yeah, I think a lot of people think that the school is one of the former mayor, Bob Lanier's relatives that, came before him.
Right. I mean, he very well could be. I mean, it's one of those things, names and generations there's Laniers all over the country. So we don't know necessarily. I guess only he would know that.
Right. Well, let me ask this. So HISD had a board meeting in February, and they said that they wanted the name changed to this school as well as some others. Why do they want the name changed?
Well, I'm not really sure. So, I mean, it started off as from a letter from Rodney Ellis asking, I think the letter was addressed to Ronner Skiller and Jones and not the superintendent, quite interestingly enough. And it was asking for 6 different schools to be added, to have their name changed. How we all found out was about a week before the actual board meeting, and we got a phone call at home, and how Lanier ended up on this list, none of us understand. So that's the...
So I think what happened was they broadened, they had an initial effort to address these probably very commonly known Confederate leaders. Mm-hmm. So I think the motivation behind that was quite clear. I think what we don't know is there came a point where they sort of broadened their definition. We don't want to do just Confederate leaders. We want loyalists. We want sympathizers. Mm-hmm. But interestingly, in the face of that, only maybe a couple of schools then got added to that. So while I think we understand the original impetus, that secondary, let's broaden the definition, I don't know if there was an incident that caused that, or where that was from. I don't know. It was just that.
Yeah, because I understand that the original list included schools like Lee, named after Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson, guys who were really prominent leaders in the Civil War for the South. And all of a sudden you end up with Sidney Lanier on there. And Sidney Lanier, if you ask people, and like Adrienne was saying, he's known for being a poet. And I don't know if anything he did in the war would have changed the outcome one way or another. From what I've heard from you all, probably didn't have one iota to do with it. Is that right?
I think you've really illuminated the issue, because this discussion to rename the schools, this is not something that came about just before the vote. I mean, there's been months. And so that was ample time for members of the Lanier community to say, oh my goodness, our school is named after someone involved in the Confederacy. How do we feel about that? Should we protest? Should we not? Nothing. The radio silence from the Lanier community. I just don't think we associated ourselves with that discussion, which tells you how unoppressive that name is in the broader community. Nobody stepped up and said, what about Lanier? Why don't you include that in your list? Mm-hmm. Something to think about.
Now, Ron, you've lived in Houston a very long time and in the community.
Absolutely.
Did you see, were there people marching against the name, or were there even undercurrents?
We saw, the unfortunate thing about this entire presentation is that it was a solution searching for a problem. Mm-hmm. There was no recognition among the community. And again, I've lived in Houston since I was born in 1955. I can tell you that Robert E. Lee, I have some association with the Confederacy. Sidney Lanier was a conscript and a private whose Confederate involvement had absolutely no place in the community consciousness at all. Mm-hmm. But there now seems to be this sweeping of unrelated leadership, that's affecting this issue. And quite frankly, it's been very disruptive in the community. It's been very disruptive to kids who are going through testing and a very rigorous academic environment. It is a completely unnecessary distraction.
Yeah, and from what I've seen, a lot of the children had no idea what Lanier's background was. They just knew that it was Lanier, and it's a school that's known for doing well at things. Maybe you all can address that.
Yeah, so I mean, it's the greatest group of kids I think I have ever met. These kids are thoughtful, and they are scholars, and that is what the school teaches. Mm-hmm. And so I think that when you look at a man, you look at a man in his whole being, and so it really wasn't an issue. I mean, quite frankly, we live in the South, and I think it would be hard to throw a stone without hitting someone who served in the Confederate Army. So to even bring this up without looking at the entire body of the man is kind of not how I would go about doing things, and not what we teach our children.
Right.
I think too, some of the consequences of this, the Board of Trustees, their mission statement is to improve education. And unfortunately, I think that so far from what I've seen, there's been some really bad fallout from this. Initially, Lanier's response, the school's community's response was to say, okay, how do we feel about this? We took community polls. We took a poll within the school. And it was pretty clear from the results of the polls that an overwhelming majority of students and members of the community were not in favor of the change. And so what happened with these students is they felt like they did their due diligence, voiced their concerns, and those concerns were blatantly disregarded by their representatives. And so now that we're in a period of having to discuss the name change, there's a lot of apathy among the students because they've lost a little bit of faith in being represented. They were very burned the first time around.
Sure. I'd like you to hold that thought. We're going to carry you guys over to the next segment, but I want to continue this discussion right after these messages. You're listening to The Price of Business.